Afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Bethel Dukes branch of ASALH for our first in a series of presentations that we will be hosting throughout the year of 2021. We had an excellent selection of presenters in 2020, and I hope that some of you did get a chance to join in on some of those presentations. Last year's theme was Afro-Americans and the Vote, and we had some speakers that were actually in the news later on, like Dr. Reverend Minister Lamar, when they had the burning of the Black Lives Matter flyer during some of the protests, who spoke, but he was one of our speakers, and several other speakers, Marvin Jones, who gave us a very good presentation, and on and on. This year we have 6 speakers lined up, and if you go to the chat, you can find out by going to the ASALH branch, the Bethel Dukes branch page on the ASALH's homepage, and find out the list of speakers that we'll have for this year. I'd like to acknowledge the program team who is on today: LaVonda Broadneck, Dr. Jones, who's president of the branch, and Demita Green, who is our webmaster and keeping us all in line and keeping track of the time. And with us today is Ms. Barbara Flewellyn, who will be our guest speaker, which we will hear from shortly. In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jones, who will welcome the group and tell us some of the exciting things that ASALH, the national chapter, is doing, as well as the branch, and we'll move on from there. From there, we'll go to LaVonda Broadneck, who will give introduction to our speaker, and then you have a chance to hear our speaker and the wonderful things she has to say about the presentation that you'll be a part of today. And thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Eric, for that rousing introduction. We have to love Eric. He is a member of our branch, but he's also a public librarian, so he does all this kind of outreach on a regular basis on behalf of knowledge, information, and technology, so thank you. I want to welcome all of you to the 2021 ASALH annual presentations of the Bethel Dukes branch. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History is the oldest continuous organization of lay and professional historians that chronicle, present, share, and document the life of Africana peoples. Since 1926, Dr. Carter G. Woodson's organization, that was founded in 1915, has selected a Negro history theme. And we have moved that theme from Negro History Week in the 1920s to Black History Month in 1976 to now African American History Month in the 21st century. What we seek to do during the course of this month is to celebrate the history and culture of African American peoples. So we have moved from just simply a month to 365 Africana American history. So our national theme this year is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. You can visit asalh.org to learn more about the festivals that we're going to be having throughout the course of February, but also conversations throughout our branches nationwide on the nature of the Black family. So the organization, ASALH, is a national umbrella organization that's comprised of branches throughout various cities and hamlets around the country. In Washington, D.C., the Bethel Dukes branch is about one of the oldest branches in the city, of 45 plus years old. Our namesake, Bethel Dukes, and his wife, Miss Piccola Dukes, were the founders of this branch. And so when he passed on, they thought it fitting to name the branch after him, changing our name from the far northeast, southeast branch to the Bethel Dukes branch. What we do in our branch is just sit and have conversation amongst ourselves and welcome the community. We usually meet in the Woodridge branch of the public library, but since COVID, we have had it turned to a digital platform. But we have made use of that platform, and we have a YouTube channel. So all of the conversations Eric was mentioning, you can go visit our YouTube channel, Bethel, THEL Dukes, DUKES, and you can actually view some of our past programming. So we thank our presenters for allowing us to record them and to share their intellectual property, but also we're happy to be able to share the history of our people and the struggles, the overcoming, and the great influence. So sit back and enjoy, and please put your questions in the chat. And we look forward to having a lively conversation with Ms. Flewellen and research she's done on her brother-in-law, ICABOD. Thank you and enjoy.
Good afternoon. My name is LaVonda Broadnax. I'd like to welcome you, and it is my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker. Ms. Barbara Flewellyn embarked on her career as a historian with a focus on genealogy after retirement from another career, personal assessment, pertinent coursework, and joining state and local genealogy societies. Her first book was about her own family, titled Jake Williams and His Descendants, Marango County, Alabama. The response from her 100 newly identified relatives was very positive, and they collectively decided that this would be their only Christmas gift. And that was because, and I quote, they felt there could be nothing more valuable. Can you imagine how inspiring and encouraging this was for Mrs. Flewellen? Her next two books dealt with family history also. In 2010, she did The Howards and the Hugheses of Marango County, Alabama, and Escabaya County, Florida. In 2012, she did The Circes and the Flewellens of Monroe and Bibb Counties, Georgia. In 2013, she did her first community history, The African-American Community of Carolina, Marion County, West Virginia. These works were acquired by libraries and historical societies in the areas where the descendants live. In fact, Muriel Jackson, the head of the Genealogical and Historical Room at the Washington Memorial Library in Macon, Georgia, described her work, and I quote, as very organized, easy to follow, and very well done. Yvonne Stoll, the director of the West Florida Genealogical Society, who first helped her with her research, then after her work was published, requested permission to use it in classes on researching African-American ancestry. Mrs. Flewellen book signings and speaking engagement led others to request that she assist them or write their histories. To these requests, she was willing and able. A few examples include, In His Presence, a memoir in traditional gospel music. This was done in 2014 by Helen Turner Thompson, who is an award-winning international gospel musician. Her work is the most thorough history of African-American churches in Cleveland to date. Another example is My Mind in Rhyme, and this was done in 2015 by Daron Frazier. And this is actually a poetry collection by her grandson. He suffered a severe fall while in college, leaving him a quadriplegic. But he returned to college, he earned his BA, he earned his BS and his MBA, and along the way, he continued his fondness for writing poetry. This collection reflects his observations of people, politics, and God. Can you imagine this grandmother's joy in working with her grandson to bring this book to fruition? Another example is titled From Chosen to Freedom, Trek of the Namkongs. And this was done in 2016 by David Namkong. And it's actually the history of his family. He starts with his grandfather, who was an interpreter for the king during the last dynasty in Korea. And then it continues with the immigration of his father to the US and culminates with David's life as a NASA aerospace engineer in Cleveland and his siblings in New York. This book was actually translated and distributed in Korea and chosen as a gift to a Korean delegation. Summarizing Mrs. Flewellen using the ASALH 2021 theme, I would say her experience and body of work offer a rich tapestry for exploring the history of families. ASALH friends and followers know well that Carter G. Woodson is credited as being the father of African American history. Today, I encourage you to enjoy and be inspired by Barbara W. Flewellyn as she introduces us to the father of the African American Museum. Through her research and publication, ICABOD FLEWELLEN, pioneer of the Black History Museum movement. Mrs. Flewellen.
Righty. Good afternoon. It's just a delight for me to share the story of my brother-in-law, Ichabod Flewellen. He's noted as being the founder of the first African-American history museum in the country. And he did so in Cleveland in 1953. As a young child, born in West Virginia in 1916, he noted that when he was in school, that the only photos that he ever saw of African Americans were those of slaves, people working out in the fields with cotton and bags over their shoulders. This did not really link up at all to the stories that he had been told of the feats of African Americans by his father and some of the elders in the family. So he made it a point as a result of this, of doing newspaper clippings of any feat that featured an African American. You could see why he would become attracted to some of the other historians who were trying to promote the contributions made by African Americans. He continued to make his collections of news articles and artifacts and books and photos through the rest of his life, highlighting the features of Flewellen himself and some of the feats of many of the African Americans throughout the world. This collection continued until his death in 2001 at age 85. Just prior to his death in 2001, he donated a major part of his 60-year collection to the East Cleveland Public Library. And then the major part or minor part of his collection, which was more the personal part, his personal diaries, his photos, and all of the other artifacts that he had collected for himself, he left to our family. And it is from that vast and really fantastic collection of his personal papers that I was first able to research and do the family history. And as a result of his papers, I was also able to recently actually complete his biography. It was while reading his personal notes that I was just in awe of how detailed he could record events, how he could describe the person. And the most important part of this that made his notes so rare is that he was able to document his emotions about that event and that person. I knew that this was rare because how many of us have read biographies of pioneer in any discipline and not only read about the event, but to read about his thoughts and feelings at that particular moment. This was such a good find, and it made his biography more of an autobiography because I was able to literally lift blocks of narrative from his diaries and his personal files, unedited, and place it in book form, chronological order to tell his story. His story is also one of how a man without a college degree who earned his living as a maintenance person and delivering mail in the VA system could actually establish a museum. It also tells a story of a man who felt that he had a mission and he persevered, and how he did that until he was actually successful. I would like now just to show you a 10-minute clip of a video and introduce you to ICABOD FLEWELLEN.
On April 15, 1953, ICABOD FLEWELLEN established the first public history museum for African Americans in Cleveland, Ohio, the Afro-American Cultural and Historical Society. The society operated initially from his home on Harkness Road. The society was a group of prominent community residents who supported Flewellen's goal of one day building a standalone museum. Flewellen's home served as a place for exhibits, public speakers, classes on Black history, and a general office for the officers of the society. In April 1955, the group held their first open house. Among the displays was Garrett Morgan's traffic light. Flewellen's interest in Black history began as a young boy growing up in West Virginia. He was the oldest of 6 children born to Reverend John Henry and Julia Tapley Flewellen. His father was an African Methodist Episcopal minister. The family settled in Williamson, West Virginia, the first and largest of several mining towns that would be their home. Reverend Flewellen was assigned the role of a traveling itinerant minister in newly developing districts in southern West Virginia. Consequently, the family was constantly moving. Thousands of Blacks were migrating from the South to the coal mining towns, so the area was bustling with activity. The constant moving, coupled with Reverend Flewellen's scanty salary, put a tremendous strain on Julia and the children. Pregnant with Ichabod's brother Thomas, his mother moved with his other siblings to live with her sister in Georgia in 1930, leaving young Ichabod behind. He was 13 years old. 1 year later, Reverend Flewellen was reassigned to Mannington, a northern town in West Virginia. There, the young Flewellen attended and graduated from Dunbar High in nearby Fairmount, West Virginia. Ichabod enjoyed reading the newspapers and was especially fascinated by the Your History column written by historian Joel A. Rogers, found in the Pittsburgh Courier. So much so, he wrote a letter to Rogers asking if all of the information was true. Speaking of his relationship with Rogers in an interview years later, Flewellen shared,
I began to write him, and this relationship between us lasted a lifetime. I probably have received as many as 100 letters from Mr. Rogers, who never tired of answering my silly questions.
Years later, Ichabod Flewellen would be featured in Joel Rogers' column for founding the first African American museum. In 1938, his father was reassigned to a church in Franklin, Pendleton County, West Virginia. Ichabod chose to stay in Mannington and keep their home. He traveled to visit his father in Franklin, and while there, he learned about the National Youth Administration, which was operated from 1935 to 1943 as a part of the Work Progress Administration. The NYA provided work training based on U.S. citizenship and financial need for youth between the ages of 16 and 25. The training was held at West Virginia State College. Ichabod enrolled in the program at West Virginia State. While at West Virginia State, Flewellen worked as a chauffeur for the dean, Professor James C. Evans. The job afforded him the opportunity to meet dignitaries that visited the college, and he became close friends with Professor Evans. One of the dignitaries was Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the founders of Black History Week. His respect for Woodson and the association prompted his lifetime membership and active participation in Woodson's organization. Flewellen read in the newspaper about a civil pilots program that the Roosevelt administration was starting. He immediately wrote a letter to the president suggesting that West Virginia State be considered as a location. He also mentioned that he would be interested in becoming a student pilot. He was currently in the school's automotive program and was one of the top students. It was not long after he sent the letter to President Roosevelt that Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune visited the college. She was a member of FDR's Black Cabinet and a close friend of the First Lady, Eleanor. Shortly after Dr. Bethune's arrival, she asked to speak to the young man who had written the letter to FDR. Meeting Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune would be something he spoke about often and proudly. He always ended his story with his belief that in some small way, his letter was a factor in West Virginia State becoming the first Black college to initiate the civilian pilot program. His belief in the power of the pen was solidified. He wrote every president after that, as well as countless letters to family, friends, politicians, and would-be supporters. Ichabod proudly enrolled as one of the first students in the program and received his student pilot certificate. He later washed out due to his inability to land the plane. Ichabod Flewellen was drafted into the United States Army. The Army afforded the opportunity to visit many foreign countries, where he frequented the local museums. He realized most cultures have their own museum. And after these visits, he was even more determined to have a museum to celebrate Black culture. After being honorably discharged in 1945, Flewellen chose to settle in Cleveland, Ohio, to be with his mother and siblings who had migrated there from Georgia. When he arrived in Cleveland, he began to assess the area's interest in learning more about Black history. He could find little or no effort to educate Black citizens on their history. He began to search for people of influence and work to pique their interest in establishing a group, with the specific goal of promoting and educating the masses about the contribution of Blacks to the world. He found 10 people, and in 1953, he created the Afro-American Cultural and Historical Society. It is with the support of this group that he hoped to ultimately build a museum. He finally received his long-sought-after degree in 1984, graduating as Western Reserve's oldest graduate. In 1960, the African-American Historical and Cultural Society was incorporated. That same year, the organization invited Flewellen's mentor, historian Joel A. Rogers to Cleveland.
It was at that particular time that in 1960, when Joel A. Rogers arrived in Cleveland for the first foray of the organization out into the Cleveland area itself. Up to this point, the organization had focused mostly on the Black community, realizing that they had to have full support of that group before they then advanced out into the city to take on even larger groups and gain influence as a credible organization. The experience with at the luncheon with J.A. Rogers was such a major success that it exceeded all of their expectations. And the name of the organization began to circulate in larger audience throughout not only Cleveland, but the Ohio area. This is truly a story of how an organization with Flewellen were able to gain influence toward building a museum by really handling the social opportunities that came their way. The next big event was the Parade of Progress, which occurred in 1964. And this event actually was celebrating the opening of the new convention center in downtown Cleveland. Up until this point, whenever there were any big events in downtown Cleveland for the greater Cleveland audience, they were mostly ethnic groups just discussing and celebrating pretty much their own culture. With this organization, with Flewellen, they were noted as a nationality, and for the first time were actually invited to participate in the citywide celebration. The Black community being totally behind them in this made this another major success. They built a booth, they decorated the booth, city residents donated items, business organizations provided money, and it is noted in large newspaper articles following this event that over 50,000 people had actually visited the booth and became much more familiar with African-American history. This continued as the organization became better known within the community itself. They became involved with the schools. And as a fact of working with the schools, Flewellen and his organization decided to take on the task of integrated textbooks. So the Flewellen group, working with some community groups, combined their efforts and worked with the school board. And they were actually able to integrate some of the school's books, starting with elementary. This success then led Flewellen being invited to a member of 12 educators and legislators who then would do the same, I should say, take the same process and integrate the textbooks in Ohio. This then led to 1976, when the organization for the first time were not only asked to participate in the bicentennial celebration, but actually be part of the planning. And again, this was very, very successful. This was such a step in the right direction for the Flewellen and his group that he wanted to have a memento of this occasion. Flewellen hired the well-known Black artist Billy Haynes to design a medallion. And that medallion was approved, plated, and was plated in gold, silver, bronze, and antique bronze. The coins were then sold as fundraising items for the organization, but it was also used as gifts to those people in the community who had done a great deed. I mentioned the medallion because the medallion, this particular medallion, is the only artifact that is represented in the of the organization in Flewellen that's housed in the African-American Museum in Washington, D.C. It's framed, it has Flewellen's name, and it also lists the occasion by which it was designed. Now, just below this particular framed medallion happens to be a large photo of Black historians, and it's entitled "The Founders." Among those on the photos are Flewellen and historian Margaret Burroughs and their contemporaries. Flewellen was used by the group as the consultant since he had begun a museum in 1953. And with his help, Margaret Burroughs and her group opened up the ASALH Museum in Chicago in 1961. And then Charles Wright's Museum in Detroit was opened in 1965. And then this continued until we had really small museums throughout the country in some of the major cities. This progress of the organization continued, and by that time, the house with which Flewellen had purchased years ago for the organization, which was the base of the organization and had been actually the first museum, was just overloaded with supplies and exhibits, and from ceiling to floor, one could only walk through the house in a path. From that point, the group knew that they would have to have another location. And they had 2 or 3 other larger, older buildings within the city with an effort to expand and to be able to show all of their exhibits. Their goal, however, continued to be a new building. And sadly, that did not come to fruition, but we did in fact have a museum. And this building that you're looking at now at one time had actually been a public library. It was just 2 streets from Flewellen's home. It was ideal. And even though it was an older building and needs of repair, it served the purpose. In 1984, when they had the ribbon cutting for this particular building, in honor of Flewellen's help and support, they renamed the building in his honor, the ICABOD FLEWELLEN building, which still exists, although under a different group. In 1984 was a pivotal time for Flewellen. As you saw earlier in the clip, he also earned his bachelor's degree from Case Western Reserve, being the oldest graduate at age 76 to graduate. He knew that this degree was important because all throughout the years, he had become the mentor for many other younger historians gaining their master's and their PhDs. He knew that there was a whole new branch of historians coming, and so he wanted to be part of that. Once he attained his bachelor's, he really made plans to move on to get his master's degree. Sadly, at that particular time, it became public that there had been disagreements and some debate between the Board of Trustees and Flewellen on the proper way to manage their organization and the museum. Their disagreements grew to such a degree that the locks were changed on the museum and Flewellen was not given a key. He was deeply wounded, deeply hurt. And this was the first time that he was without a mission and felt that he had been betrayed and that all of his work had been for naught. He took about 6 months to make a decision about what his next plans would be. During that time, the organization literally changed the name of the organization from the African American Cultural and Historical Society to that of the African American Museum, which it is still known as today. Flewellen felt that it was time for him then to move in a different direction. So at that time, he decided to start a new organization. He named it the African American Asiento Memorial Society. And his goal was to start anew using the massive collection that was in his home, place it in another building, and establish another museum. Sadly, a year after that, he was informed that he was ill, that he would not have the energy to continue with the schedule. And accepting this, he knew then that he would have to find another place, another location to place his 60-year collection of artifacts. This is when he made an arrangement with the East Cleveland Public Library to see that after his death, that they would assume responsibility for his collection. He chose the public library because he believed strongly that the history of a people should be within the community, and it should be accessible and not locked away and brought out just once or twice a year. The caveat for the library assuming his collection was that they would provide at least 4 programs per year on African American history, but using the relics and artifacts from his collection. And this has been done thus far by the library. The picture that you see now is actually one of the spaces in a new wing at the East Cleveland Library, simply known as the ICABOD FLEWELLEN collection. And this is the study room, and it's also a display room for exhibits pertaining to African American history. You may note that in the lower level, the right side of the photo that you're looking at is a picture of Flewellen's younger brother, Thomas, with the portrait that was donated by the family and given to the library to hang within this particular space. What you've heard has been some of the feats and my assessment of Flewellen's history toward gaining recognition as a credible organization within the Black community, as well as Cleveland at large, for Black history, but also the life of a man who was able to accomplish that. What I'd like you to hear now is the assessment of Flewellen's life by himself. This was the last interview that he gave to one of his nieces, Nicole Golston. I'm not just a talking person, I'm a doing person. Perhaps that were times that I should have been talking. I'm getting close to 80 and I've got to move. My only regret is that there are a lot of things I should have done. All my life, I wanted to build and run a museum. I didn't succeed, not the way I wanted. Perhaps I helped mostly getting integrated textbooks and providing information to Black youth. It was important that they know their heritage. I didn't have the degrees in Black studies, something I always wanted. I loved being in school all my life. Some felt that I wasn't polished or sophisticated, but I had the commitment, the knowledge, and the experience in getting things done. Suppose in the next 5 years, I get that degree and am ready to make some money. Then the good Lord says, Flew, come on here. You've been down there long enough. My story is how one man's stubborn determination got him a museum, and how now, even though the museum may be a loss, his determination to graduate from college, and he still dug into the history which he loved, kept him going. Leadership is a tough job. You have to paint a vision and eliminate the negatives. As a pioneer in the field, I could see the possibilities, images that could not be seen by others. An historian is supposed to leave footprints in the sand of time. For some, it was by accident. For me, it was a purpose. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Mrs. Flewellen, on that very engaging and very well thought out presentation of the life of your brother-in-law. And there are lots of great commentary coming through on the chat, but I would like to ask a question.
Certainly.
How was it to know someone who knew Mrs. Bethune, who knew Carter G. Woodson, who knew J.A. Rogers? I mean, that alone, those are the giants of the 20th century that we read about. And for him to have encountered these people and to have been influenced and encouraged by these people, do you feel that had anything to do with how he sought to live his life?
Yes, I think it did. I think he was inspired by the people. And the fact that he felt so strongly about the history, and he was given the encouragement by those who had succeeded in that effort. And he knew that could help him in the future. So yes, just knowing them and thinking about his meeting with them and knowing their story helped him tremendously, and keeping him encouraged in setting his goals, in meeting his goals.
And I like the aspect of his idea of a museum as a young person who did not experience seeing those visuals in the classroom or seeing those visuals in various museum spaces. How do you feel that his choosing to select a museum and not, let's say, artists in terms of street signs or what we call pedestrian art, but to do a museum, what do you think was the intentionality behind his desire to not just want to build one, but also to curate one and to manage one? How do you think that he saw that in terms of reconciling the lack of information he had, or the lack of race pride that was not instilled in him by schools?
It's because once he had the museum established, you know, albeit beginning in his home, he was able to connect with the school systems and arrange so that there could be bus tours of school children to come to the museum. And he loved this part of it because he would take them on a tour, but also give them a history lesson at the time. And I think just his connection with the youth, was his main goal, because he felt strongly that if he could instill the pride of heritage into them, that his goals would ultimately be met, in our history being just incorporated in the history of the country, rather than just African-American history.
You mentioned the DuSable, you mentioned the Wright Museum, and then the one in Ohio. We also have in Washington, D.C., the Anacostia Museum, all of them kind of birthing out of that 1950s, 1960s effort to really kind of institutionalize Black history, from the Civil Rights Movement to the idea of having objects and artifacts in institutionalized places for recollection. I'm
Yeah.
wondering that the niece that he left his interview with, what does she do? Is there anyone in the family that has continued in the tradition of maybe museumship? I know you're a writer, and you're also, curating the history of the family, but is there anyone else who's taken up the mantle of the cultural stewardship that he has left behind as a legacy?
Well, I'm it at the moment, but the niece with whom he did the interviews with is actually journalist. And she's been a journalist at Emory University for a period of about 20 years. And she works in one of the larger schools there, publishing all of their alumni materials and literature. We're working on several other grandchildren who are in college now, who have become great writers, very, very interested in the history. And I think that we will have another one within the family to take the mantle. I'm excited about that.
And lastly, questions about the collection. You mentioned the collection. So he was very proactive, not just in the artifacts, but his documenting his own life through collecting the letters and saving all those items to kind of chronicle his encounters. Where exactly is that collection located? Could you please let us know, and where we can purchase your book?
All right. His artifacts are all in the East Cleveland Public Library in East Cleveland, Ohio. And for anyone who chooses to do research, with his materials, should contact the director of the library, who can arrange to have an archivist there to assist them. I shouldn't say much, maybe 1/3 of his material has actually been cataloged and can be sought online, that the director can give them the address to that, so that one can search through to see what artifacts and what materials are there. I think things that are especially interesting is that Flewellen kept copies of most of his materials, letters and all. And even in the book, I have placed the letters to 3 presidents, Truman, Reagan, and Clinton. And interesting enough, they all responded. So I thought that that was a credible bit and would make an interesting piece, for the book as well. My book, the book here on Flewellen's biography, can be acquired by going to my website. And I think it might be in your chat, but it is www. And let me put the screen up if you can see that, www.bwflewellenbooks.com. And it will provide all the information on how one can obtain a copy.
Well, I want to thank you so very much. We are coming to the close of our time. I would like Mr. White, I think he brings the closing remarks for us as our branch presentation. You're getting lots of rave reviews in the chat on the eloquence of the presentation and the depth of it and the breadth of it, because we are a national organization, ASALH, actually international organization. And so for him to have met Dr. Woodson, I haven't read your book, but that was an extra special plus for us to be able to know that he has such a connection to our organization, and then his stewardship throughout his life. So thank you so very much. So I'm going to ask Mr. White if he could unmute himself and chime back in, and we'll also put in the chat our presenters for next month. And also, please consider submitting a proposal for a presentation for our annual conference. Our national theme is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. And this definitely is in line with this. Our national president, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, had said that we have moved from the macro of history to now looking at the biographies and the individual lives on the granular level. How did this Black history get lived out? So for him to be with the Mary McLeod Bethune during that time of the Depression, come World War II, to having written Truman during the desegregation of he lives the greater part of the 20th century in terms of these magnificent moments on his level. And he documents that, which is very rare because we don't have those individual voices. We have the celebrity voices, but we don't have the pedestrian voices that you and I make up. So I'm very happy to see that's there and that your book is there. I see Eric is probably not going to be able to join us, so I'm just going to close this out. Are there any last questions? I'm looking in the chat here. I hear someone talking.
Yeah.
Hello? Hello?
Hi, hello?
Yes.
I don't know. I wanted to ask the speaker if she knew of Ella Mae Cheeks Johnson, a woman who lived to be 106, I believe, but she lived in Cleveland and was very active in starting not this museum, but I've got the book in my hand, but I was trying to look through it quickly. It was one of the Black Dance Troops Cultural Center in Cleveland. Do you know of that lady?
No, I do not.
Ella Mae Cheeks Johnson. Okay,
No.
it's okay. Thank you.
All right.
That's one of our branch members, Linda White, who's a remarkable genealogist and always making connections. So it might have some genealogical connection for her. So I
Sorry,
guess
I couldn't help you.
that's quite
No problem. Okay.
That's quite her organization too, the Association African American Historical and Genealogical Societies, another great group that does amazing work as well. Any last questions? Well, for the good of the order, I want to thank Mrs. Barbara Flewellyn for sharing her work on the amazing and remarkable life of her brother-in-law, ICABOD FLEWELLEN, and we want to thank him for his cultural stewardship and also thinking of those of us who succeed him and that we all have a future and a past. So we want to thank him for being a good example of how important it is to chronicle our own lives and to celebrate our own selves and to also realize there's someone coming behind us that needs to be able to know how to navigate their history and understand their racial pride. So I want to thank you all very much for attending, and that on our next meeting, we will be meeting in February the 28th, and we will have Dr. Allison Parker speaking to us on Mary Church Terrell, another author, talking about the life and times of an amazing suffragist as well, who documented her life. So thank you very much, Ms. Flewellen. Thank you everyone for being in attendance, and do take care. Happy New Year, happy new presidential administration, and happy Black History Year. Thank you and good night.